In today's episode of Bach Home, we continue the discussion of the youthful Fryderyk Chopin. I will tell you about his first trip to Szafarnia in the Mazovia region of Poland, where he will for the first time hear the folk music. I will of course perform for you as well. You will hear the Mazurka Opus 17 number 4 and learn a little bit about the compositional techniques that Chopin employs in his Mazurkas. This program is made with the support of the Culture, Science and Education grant from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland. As you may know, Chopin died at a very early age of just 39. He died of tuberculosis and his health was never strong. In fact, Hector Berlioz, his contemporary, wrote Chopin was dying all his life. Already as a young teenager, Chopin began exhibiting signs of poor health, which was of course a great cause of worry for his loving parents. They decided to send him to Shafarnia in the province of Mazovia, some 200 kilometers from Warsaw. Chopin's good friend, who was a student at the boarding school and a son of his father's very good friend and a former student as well, had a summer home in Shafarnia where Chopin was invited to join him for the entire summer in 1824 and 25. Chopin at the time was only 14 years old. We often think of Fryderyk Chopin as the poet of the piano, detached, perhaps somewhat aloof. Well, you will be happy to know that as a teenager, Chopin loved to have fun. He had lots of good friends with whom he spent time after his classes at the Warsaw Lyceum. He was said to have gathered them around the piano and listened to their terrifying stories while improvising the soundtrack to it on the piano. Chopin's trip to Shafarnia was his first experience with the countryside. Chopin started each day at the piano. The 7 a.m. practice was followed by breakfast and then plenty of time with his friend Dominik Dziewanowski to spend outside and make trouble. The two often went on adventures, had close encounters with the local animals, and took trips to neighboring villages, often horseback riding. Chopin's parents were thrilled that the boy could spend so much time in fresh air. He wrote them frequently, and imaginative as Chopin was, he didn't just write them letters. He turned them into a Szafarnia Courier, which was a spoof on a newspaper known in Warsaw as the Warsaw Courier. The newspaper, called in Polish Kurier Szafarski, was divided into two sections, foreign and local news. Fryderyk was also very aware that back home, the Warsaw Courier was subject to censorship, and therefore, to keep things as professional as he could, he appointed Dominik's aunt, Ludwika Dziewanowska, to be the official censor. Just so you get an idea of Chopin's sense of humor, let me read you an excerpt from the local news of August 12, 1824. A hen went lame, and a drake fighting with a goose lost a leg. A cow became so ill it is grazing in the garden. Consequently, an edict was issued on the 14th forbidding all piglets to enter the garden on pain of death. The article was passed by the censor Ludwika Dziewanowska. Chopin wrote under the name of Pichon, an anagram of his name. 2 weeks later in the home news he reports, "The honorary Monsieur Pichon has encountered all kinds of unpleasantness from mosquitoes. They are biting him all over, but fortunately not on the nose, or it will become even longer than it already is." You can clearly see from this entry that Chopin was able to poke fun not only at others, but also himself. We read in the most recent biography of Fryderyk Chopin by Alan Walker that there was a sizable Jewish population in Shafarnia and in the Mazovia region in general. The local butcher, milkmen were very likely to be Jewish. Consequently, Chopin would hear klezmer bands playing locally and certainly absorbed those influences immediately. Alan Walker, the author of the Chopin biography, mentions Chopin's entry from September 3rd, where the boy describes his performance of what he calls the Little Jew. It might have been the early version of the Mazurka you're about to hear today. He apparently impressed the locals so much with this performance that he was offered 10 florins to perform at a Jewish wedding. In fact, it is very interesting when we consider the folk influence in the music of Fryderyk Chopin that a lot of that influence would have come from the music of the Jewish communities and the vivid and vibrant improvisation of the klezmer bands. Chopin will publish the Mazurka as Opus 17, number 4, only 10 years later, once he has settled in Paris. In his work, Chopin never really quoted directly any of the folk tunes that he heard in Shafarnia, but he created a world of sound so vividly conjuring the atmosphere of the countryside. And we know that he was very eager to return to Shafarnia the following year, which he did, in order to be able to absorb and enjoy more of the music making of the local musicians celebrating weddings and harvests. The word Mazurka is borrowed from the name of the Mazovia region, and it must have forever stayed in Chopin's heart as this beloved picture of his motherland. We know that his last composition that he wrote on his deathbed in Paris and was never able to complete was also a Mazurka. You're about to hear Mazurka Opus 17, number 4, one of Chopin's most beloved pieces. It was actually published shortly after Chopin already settled in Paris, still hoping to be able to return. Little did he know that hope would never be realized. Poland was on his mind throughout his life, even though he was never able to go back. And now let's hear this beautiful Mazurka together. This mazurka starts in a particularly strange way, as though looking for a right key to start. Could we be in F major? Chopin answers no. You will notice plenty of chromaticism in the left hand, descending chromaticism. Chopin, as you may remember from the first episode, was a great admirer of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he understood the symbolism behind descending chromaticism. You can learn some more about this from my previous Bach at Home videos when I discussed the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. But here in the left hand, immediately you will recognize this descending chromatic pattern, which would symbolize often grief, sadness, perhaps even death. On top of that grieving left hand, you hear a simple melody, which might have been a folk melody, but we do know that Chopin hardly ever employed actual folk music in his pieces. This melody is probably conjured up in his imagination, but really bringing to mind the folk music of the Mazovia region. Very simple and free. Chopin never presents the same melody the same way twice. Each time you will hear a small, very nuanced variation. So the second time you hear this tune, it is already changed, and now Chopin writes delicatissimo, as delicately as possible. So instead of a simple line that you heard at the beginning, Chopin asks us to subdivide this melodic line and produce this gorgeous ornament. Chopin's imagination is endless, and his melodic invention never stops. The third time you discover the melody, it is presented in triplets. And it sounds very improvised. Clearly, Chopin is still very inspired by what he heard in the countryside, the fiddling and the very free music making of the peasants and the local musicians. Now, here, instead of crawling chromatically the way you heard it before in the delicatissimo section, Chopin is actually presenting leaping ornaments here. You may be familiar with the concept of drone bass, an unchanging bass note that persists while the melody is freely moving about. So here you have a perfect example. If you observe my pinky playing that E. And this is something that was often associated with folk music and with the idea of the pastoral. So in fact, if you recall the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven, he plants that fifth here, and it doesn't change until here. Chopin is doing something very similar here, and we know that he was familiar with those instruments, such as the Polish basetla, which is an equivalent of a double bass with only one string, so allowing only to play a limited number of notes. Let's listen. This is the idea of the drone bass, which we will find again on the second page in the middle section of this mazurka. By the way, most mazurkas are written in a ternary form, A, B, A. So you're about to hear the B section here in the key of A major. So we're switching modes from minor to major. And just observe that left hand that is unchanging. You will notice that same feature, that a drone bass, in this case a drone fifth, really alluding to playing an instrument on open strings. You will find it in many more mazurkas of Chopin and other composers. And Chopin builds this section up to a roaring climax, only to return to the A section, where you will hear the melody improvised differently yet again. So-called grace notes. And now huge leaps. Chopin for the last time gives up the quick notes of the ornaments that he presented us with before. Last treat, an extra note in the fifth finger of the right hand, that E that rings in our memory forever. And now we enter the coda of the piece. Coda in Italian means tail, and it is that bonus material here at the end of the mazurka. You will notice the familiar idea of drone bass. The fifth finger of my left hand is going to keep playing an A, it's not going anywhere. In the meantime, you will hear that descending chromaticism, again, bringing the piece very slowly but surely down to its conclusion. That the variation be played sottovoce, so that repetition, that variation here is basically whispered. And just when you think that this is it, things do calm down considerably. Chopin adds the same material with which he started, drawing a full circle. I hope this gives you a little bit more insight into the childhood and early youth of Chopin and the tremendous influence that the time in Shafarnia had on his compositions. In the next episode, I will tell you about Chopin's siblings, about the first tragedy in his life, and about his first nocturnes. For now, thank you for tuning in, and as always, I invite you to subscribe to my channel where you will find many more videos on the Bach at Home playlist. Take care and stay well.